Imagine stepping into a world you haven't touched for decades. The sun feels too bright, the noise too loud, and even walking down a sidewalk feels like a test of survival. For men like Paul Redd, who spent over 30 years locked in solitary confinement inside California's most notorious prisons, life after release isn't freedom. It's another kind of battle. This is the story of how decades in the SHU at Pelican Bay leave scars that don't fade when the cell door finally opens. Pelican Bay State Prison was built in 1989 to house California's worst of the worst. At its core was the SHU, Security Housing Unit, a concrete labyrinth designed for permanent isolation. Inside, men spent 22 to 24 hours a day in windowless cells, with no human contact beyond guards sliding trays of food through slots in the steel doors. Exercise meant pacing in small, barren yards, nicknamed dog runs, barely larger than a garage. Paul Redd entered this system as a young man, convicted of murder in the early 1970s. Over the next 3 decades, he would spend the majority of his life locked in solitary, across institutions, but especially Pelican Bay. According to his testimony, the reasons for his SHU placement were rarely linked to misconduct. Instead, confidential informants accused him of gang involvement, and officials used those statements, often unchallengeable in court, to justify keeping him in isolation year after year. For Redd, the SHU wasn't just punishment. It was an attempt to break him. He described in interviews how filing grievances or pursuing legal action against prison conditions often brought retaliation. "They don't like when you know your rights," he told reporters. "They punish you for fighting back." By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay's SHU had become infamous worldwide. Human rights groups, psychologists, and even United Nations experts labeled it a form of torture. Men like Redd, who had spent decades without meaningful human contact, became living examples of what indefinite isolation does to the human mind. Yet, for all its cruelty, the SHU was never just about crime or safety. It was about control. And for men trapped inside, survival meant adapting to a life where every day was the same: silence, steel, and shadows. For men in Pelican Bay's SHU, the punishment was not just physical, it was psychological. Experts call it social death. With no clocks, no natural light, and almost no human interaction, the brain begins to unravel. Days blur into weeks, weeks into years. Prisoners describe the sensation as living in a box where time simply stops. Paul Redd spent over 30 years in solitary, most of it in concrete cells the size of a parking space. He later explained that he would sometimes lose track of what year it was. Reading became a lifeline, but even books arrived irregularly, often censored or delayed. Letters from family were opened, monitored, and sometimes withheld, leaving men starved for human connection. The toll was brutal. According to research cited by the American Civil Liberties Union, prolonged solitary confinement is linked to hallucinations, paranoia, panic attacks, and even suicide. Redd himself spoke of the endless hum of silence being so loud it could drive a man insane. Some inmates created rituals to hold on to sanity, pacing the length of the cell for hours, doing push-ups in exact counts, or whispering to themselves just to hear a voice. One former Pelican Bay prisoner told reporters, "You start to feel like you don't exist. You're alive, but not living. You're erased." That statement mirrored Redd's own experience. He said that every time the heavy steel door shut, it wasn't just the sound of confinement, it was the sound of being buried alive in slow motion. And yet, men in the SHU adapted in ways that outsiders struggled to understand. Some developed extraordinary mental discipline. Others turned to legal advocacy, writing petitions and lawsuits from inside their cells. Redd was among those who fought back with the only weapon available: words on paper. His activism from behind bars would eventually place him in the center of a historic lawsuit that changed solitary confinement in California forever. By 2011, men inside Pelican Bay's SHU had reached a breaking point. After years, sometimes decades, of living in windowless concrete cells, many realized that the system was designed not to rehabilitate, but to erase them. What began as individual complaints turned into something far more powerful: collective resistance. That summer, more than 6,000 prisoners across California joined a coordinated hunger strike, refusing meals in protest of the state's policy of indefinite solitary confinement. At the center of the organizing were men in the SHU, including figures like Paul Redd, who helped spread word through letters and handwritten notes smuggled between units. Their demands were simple, yet profound: an end to indefinite SHU terms based solely on confidential informants, basic human rights like phone calls, photographs, and educational opportunities, the chance to leave isolation through behavior, not accusations. The hunger strike shocked the public. Families rallied outside prison gates. Advocacy groups like the Center for Constitutional Rights and the American Civil Liberties Union amplified the message nationwide. Media outlets from the New York Times to the Atlantic began running stories about men locked away for decades with no clear path out. California officials at first dismissed the strike, labeling participants as gang members trying to manipulate the system. But as weeks turned into months, and as another RO, one of strikes in 2013, drew nearly 30,000 participants statewide, the state could no longer ignore the crisis. The spotlight on Pelican Bay grew brighter, exposing conditions the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture later declared cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. For men like Redd, the hunger strikes were not just about food, they were about visibility. "We had to starve ourselves just to be seen," one prisoner later explained. The strikes marked a turning point, a moment when the silence of solitary confinement was broken by collective voices demanding justice. This resistance would lay the groundwork for a historic lawsuit, Ashker vs. Governor of California, that would finally crack the system of indefinite solitary confinement wide open. The hunger strikes had done their job. They drew public attention, sparked outrage, and gave prisoners the momentum to take their fight to court. In 2012, a group of long-term SHU prisoners, including Todd Ashker, filed a class-action lawsuit with the Center for Constitutional Rights. The case, Ashker v. Governor of California, directly challenged the practice of keeping men in solitary for decades without meaningful review. The lawsuit argued that California's system was unconstitutional. Thousands of men were being placed in SHU units not for violence or rule-breaking, but for gang validation, a process that often relied on flimsy evidence like tattoos, artwork, or anonymous informants. Once validated, prisoners could be kept in solitary indefinitely, sometimes for the rest of their lives, with no chance of release unless they debriefed by informing on others. Paul Redd's story fit this pattern. Despite decades of imprisonment, much of his SHU placement was tied to confidential accusations and his outspoken legal work. His experience became part of the broader narrative showing how the system was designed to isolate, not rehabilitate. In 2015, after years of legal battles, California finally settled. The Ashker settlement was groundbreaking. It ended indefinite solitary confinement in California. Thousands of men who had spent 10, 20, even 30 years in SHU units were suddenly eligible to transfer back to general population or less restrictive housing. Within the first year, the number of people held in long-term solitary confinement in California dropped by about 99%. Advocates called it one of the most important prison reforms in U.S. history. For men who had been buried in isolation, it was the first real chance to rejoin the living. But release from solitary wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and complicated chapter. For Paul Redd and many others, the Ashker victory opened doors. But stepping out of a small concrete cell into a crowded yard, or eventually back into the free world, was not simple. The human mind does not reset overnight. After decades of silence, men carried scars that couldn't be seen, but would shape every step of their lives outside the SHU. When the Ashker settlement took effect in 2015, hundreds of men were moved out of SHU cells almost overnight. For the first time in decades, they stepped into general population yards, surrounded by other prisoners, noise, and movement. For many, it was overwhelming. Paul Redd described it as both liberation and shock. After more than 30 years of living in near silence, the sudden chaos of a prison yard, shouts, radios, dozens of bodies moving at once, was almost unbearable. Simple acts, like standing in line for a meal or sharing a table with other inmates, felt foreign. "You forget how to be around people," one man explained after his release from solitary. Psychologists have long warned about this transition. Decades of isolation leave the brain conditioned for hypervigilance. Every sound feels like a threat. Trust becomes nearly impossible. Some men flinched when others walked too close. Others struggled with anger, feeling trapped between relief at being out of the SHU and resentment for the years stolen from them. Routines, once the anchor of survival in solitary, now became difficult to maintain. Inside the SHU, prisoners often survived by creating rigid schedules, push-ups at the same hour each day, pacing exact steps across the cell, reading the same books until the pages tore. In general population, those routines were disrupted by the unpredictable rhythm of prison life. For Red, the adjustment was not just psychological, it was political. He had spent decades building a reputation as a jailhouse lawyer, a man who stood up for prisoners' rights even from behind the steel door. Now, in the yard, he was expected to navigate a social landscape he hadn't seen in decades. Gang dynamics, alliances, and unwritten rules that had shifted during his time in isolation. The Ashker settlement was a victory, but it also revealed a haunting truth. Ending solitary confinement on paper did not erase its impact. Men like Red carried the SHU with them wherever they went. The walls might have fallen, but the isolation was still inside. When Paul Red finally walked out of prison after more than 35 years behind bars, including over 30 in solitary, it was not the triumphant moment some might imagine. Freedom came with sunlight and space, yes, but also with confusion, anxiety, and a profound sense of dislocation. Red had gone into prison in the early 1970s. By the time he came out, the world had transformed. Smartphones lit up every pocket, the internet shaped daily life, and people walked the streets with headphones, staring at screens. For a man who had spent decades measuring time by the clang of steel doors and the footsteps of guards, this new reality was alien. Psychologists describe this as post-incarceration syndrome, a condition marked by hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, and overwhelming anxiety in social settings. For long-term solitary survivors, these symptoms are amplified. Red himself admitted that crowds made him uneasy. Even grocery stores felt like chaos. Bright lights, endless choices, strangers brushing past. The trauma of isolation followed him outside. He had lost the rhythm of ordinary conversation, the habit of casual touch, even the comfort of human noise. Many nights he struggled to sleep without the familiar silence of his cell. For decades, survival had meant controlling every movement and guarding every word. In freedom, letting go of that control felt impossible. Yet, despite these challenges, Red also carried resilience. Years of writing grievances, petitions, and legal arguments had sharpened his ability to fight. He became an advocate for others, sharing his story with journalists, human rights groups, and young activists determined to end solitary confinement nationwide. His voice, once confined to prison paper, now reached classrooms, conferences, and news outlets. Still, beneath the surface, the scars of the SHU remained. Freedom gave him space, but it could not give him back the decades taken by isolation. As Red himself put it, "You can leave the cell, but the cell doesn't leave you." Paul Red's story is not unique. After the Ashker settlement, hundreds of men left the SHU and faced the same disorienting transition. Some returned to prison yards, others eventually to the streets. Many struggled. Years of silence made trust hard to rebuild. Simple social interactions, family dinners, bus rides, job interviews, felt like foreign territory. Advocacy groups stepped in to help, offering counseling, housing support, and mentorship. Yet even with assistance, the damage was clear. Some men thrived, becoming organizers and educators. Others fell into cycles of poverty, mental illness, or reincarceration. What bound them together was the invisible burden of solitary, the sense that a part of them had been left behind in those concrete cells. From Pelican Bay to the streets, the journey of men like Paul Red forces us to ask a haunting question. What does justice look like after decades in solitary confinement? The Ashker case ended the policy of indefinite isolation in California, but the scars remain. For survivors, freedom is complicated, a mix of relief and trauma, resilience and pain. And their stories carry a warning. When a society buries people in silence for decades, the punishment doesn't end at the prison gates. It echoes outward, into families, into communities, into the very idea of justice itself. As Paul Rudd once said, "I'm free, but I'll never forget. The SHU is always with me."